This is Lightning Power Lunch with Dave Mishkin and Greg Linnelli on Lightning Radio.
Clear it, he got it out of the zone. Hagel up the middle, short-handed, trying to bust across the line. He stays with the right circle, back inside, score! Brendan Hagel! A beautiful short-handed goal! And the Lightning go up 1-0 with 10:33 left in the second.
I think we've kind of killed together all year, and I know he kind of knows what I'm thinking. I know what he's thinking. Obviously, he was trying to get it clear, but he put it right up in the middle of the ice, and I just kind of read that that's where he's putting it and took off.
Yeah, it's been so fun to see his season transpire, and obviously play with him, before a couple years back. But just seems like every year he's getting more confident out there. But the best thing about it is he wants those situations. He wants to be a difference maker for us. He's counted upon in a lot of situations out there, PP, PK, 5-on-5, and he wants to step up, and he's doing that on a consistent basis for us. It's fun to see, and we're going to need him for sure down the stretch here.
It wasn't a pretty game last night for sure. First game back after the Lightning had a couple of weeks off. The league did, and it took a while for the Lightning to get into the swing of things. In fact, that was the conversation we had on the pregame show, not only for our show, but you and Chief, who was filling in for Espo last night. Hope the Hall of Famer is feeling better. But, you had kind of posed the question to Chief, like, look, how long's this rust going to be, And that was one of the concerns I think we all had for sure. Could you lean on the players who participated in the Four Nations tournament a little bit and see if they could kind of generate a little juice until the other guys caught up? But I think what we found out last night, and there were a lot of keys to this game, let's not overanalyze this. Andrei Vasilevsky was the best player on the ice. Mm-hmm. I mean, that guy was looking sharp. And maybe, ironically, the guy who had the most time off was the sharpest out of everybody.
Well, on the Lightning side, I think the concern going in, and I think concern is a fair word, that, Seattle was playing the second half of a back-to-back against the Lightning, and the Lightning were rested. Now, normally, that would be an advantage for the Lightning. Doesn't guarantee success. We've seen teams on the road playing the second half of a back-to-back, beating teams that have been at home waiting for them that didn't play the night before. The Lightning have been on the giving end of that, where they have been the winning team in the second half of a back-to-back, where they had to travel, play the night before, travel, and they beat a rested team. But the Lightning have been on the receiving end of that too, where they have been traveling and they kind of run out of gas, they fall behind. It's a challenge. Success in the regular season, one part of it is navigating through difficult parts in your schedule. Every team has it. Sometimes the Lightning are the team traveling, sometimes they are the team at home. Now, I will say this, based on how close Sunrise is to Tampa, or Fort Lauderdale, I guess, it's not a very difficult travel trip to get from at Panthers to at Lightning. And Seattle played at 6 o'clock on Saturday. So it wasn't a huge heavy lift for a back-to-back, but I think if this weren't coming out of the Four Nations face-off break, we would say, without hesitation, Greg, the Lightning have a circumstantial advantage in this game. I think last night was different. We were spitballing this leading up to this game, wondering if some of the scheduling advantage that would be on the Lightning side is offset or would be offset by the fact that Seattle had a game under its belt. And I think what we saw for much of the first two periods, it wasn't just 10 minutes. I think it was 2 periods. The Lightning looked like the less crisp team. Seattle was executing at a higher level than the Lightning, understanding that highlight that we just heard. And if you were watching the video stream, Steve had the goal, the video of the goal. That was a very well executed play from McDonough to Hagel. I understand that, and that happened in the second period. But I think if you were to watch the game, you were at the game, you listened to the game, we are usually very much on these things. Usually Phil and I, last night it was Chief with me. Kind of what's the temperature of the game? The temperature of the game was Seattle was like boom, 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 out of the defensive zone, boom, into the offensive zone, retrieving pucks, passing pucks on sticks, directing pucks to the net, retrieving them. I mean, the Lightning had to spend a lot of time in the first two periods defending without the puck. And then the Lightning, when they had the puck, they were a little off. They just were. So is this some sort of like huge problem? It was in the two games leading into the Four Nations face-off. Now, this, I would say, is 3 games in a row where we've seen this on some level. This one, I'm willing to give them a pass, though, because we understand that they had a circumstantial disadvantage. I'll use that term again. They were a team that was rusty facing a team that wasn't rusty. And yes, they had the 5 guys who played in the Four Nations face-off, but it's kind of how are you looking as a group, as a unit. Fortunately for the Lightning, and this is what you just brought up, Greg, maybe the most important guy not to have rust didn't, and that was Vasilevsky. He looked like he was not coming off a 2-week break. Or if he had a 2-week break, It didn't affect him at all. And the Lightning needed him, especially in the second period. So, Seattle is a team, they don't have a lot of, I'll call it finishers. I mean, they're in the middle of the pack offensively, but they're in the middle of the pack in the league offensively because they have scoring depth. And that's kind of been in their DNA from the get-go. The year they made the playoffs basically because they had great scoring depth. I mean, they had a terrific fourth line that year with Morgan Geekie, who's nearly got 20 goals this year with the Bruins. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, he's turned into a very valuable player for Boston. He was on that fourth line. Daniel Sprong, who can certainly score, and Seattle used him on the power play. He was on that fourth line. I'm trying to remember the third guy in the fourth line. Was it Ryan Donato? It was somebody. Yeah, I can't remember who the other guy was on the fourth line. But after they made the playoffs, that whole fourth line was gone the next year. Right. But if you look at their roster, Greg, like they entered the game last night with 10 guys with 10 or more goals. Now, a bunch of them had 10. Like they were right at 10. But that tells you 8 of them were forwards. So 8 of their 12 forwards, we want to include Capo Caco, who had some of that production with the Rangers, but I think he had scored 6 goals since coming over from the Rangers. You throw in 2 defensemen, that's 10. They have scoring depth, but what were they missing a little bit last night in a game in which they were kind of carrying play? They were missing a little finish. They were. And I think that this is a good cautionary tale for the Lightning as they have Edmonton coming up tomorrow. Like if the Lightning are going to spend as much time without the puck tomorrow as they did last night, Edmonton has some guys who, I mean, I'm stating the obvious here, right?
Sure.
They have guys who can finish. They have playmakers. They have game breakers. They have guys who, if you give them space, they will make you pay. Seattle was missing a little bit of that last night, which helped the Lightning. I thought the Lightning at points hung in there too. They kept some of that activity to the outside, but boy, they were chasing a lot. And generally, that's not really a recipe for success. But they got to play in their corner on the shorthanded goal so they're able to take a lead into the third. And, I mean, we can get more in-depth into the game. I thought the third period was by far their best period. Yeah. Not even close. And not just because they scored a couple of goals and made a 1-0 game 3-0. They were just far cleaner in their execution, and that to me is a positive sign. That it took them a couple of periods to kind of get into the swing of things. Mm-hmm. Then once they did, and so they understood, like coming out of the second intermission, they're like, all right, it's 1-0. Let's win this period or even tie this period. Let's finish well. And for whatever reason, whether it was they had 40 minutes under their belt or the game situation or they simplified things, they were just executing at a much higher level in the third period than they were in the first or the second. And as a result, Seattle had way less possession time in the third period.
I think everything you said was accurate. I think 2 things that stood out through the first 2 periods. One, it felt like, to reiterate the point, the Lightning were a step slow. They just were off. And I think that may be
mentally slow, too. Not just physically and mentally in their decision-making,
And you never know when that rust is going to shake off. It may take teams a shift. It could take teams a period or 2 periods. And for the Lightning, I think it took them a couple of periods for sure. And I think they also passed up opportunities to shoot the puck. Mm-hmm. That was something that was pretty glaring, especially early on in the first period. I mean, I can remember one, and it may have been in the first period, Gage Gonsalves was right in the slot. Yeah. And had an opportunity to shoot the puck. I mean, and I know he's not what we would consider an elite goal scorer. He's a very good passer, and that's exactly what he did. But he took a high percentage play, and he chose the low percentage option. which was a pass to the side of the goaltender. To the goaltender situation, not meaning Tampa Bay. 28-year-old rookie. Chief was like, look, guy has experience, but not at the NHL level. Obviously, you pointed this out during the call, and I think this was the frustrating part about the Lightning not shooting. I didn't think he was comfortable.
Yeah.
And you mentioned he looked nervous. You said he looked nervous.
Yeah, I wasn't going to contradict Chief because Chief knows goaltenders better than me. And he pointed out a few times at 6'4", this guy was big enough, Stezga was big enough to kind of eat up some of the net just based on his positioning, which is why, I'm not sure size rules as much in the NHL as it did pre-rule changes, honestly.
Yeah. When Garth Snow was in net,
I'm talking
huge.
about non-goalies. I'm talking about non-goalies. It used to be like the idea was you can't coach size.
Yeah.
So like the Marty St. Louis of the world were kind of groundbreaking players for a reason because there weren't a lot of them because you could clutch and grab and, you could basically hang on to players. Then they changed the rules and it became a little bit more of a speed skill game, which opened the door for some players that weren't as big. And so you can overcome what we'll call a size disadvantage if you were quick enough, right? And because obstruction was taken out of the game, that favored the smaller, quicker players. You can still be a big player, but you really have to be able to skate now. Like the big, slow players, you don't see as many of them in the league as you did, let's say, in the 90s, right? The style of play has changed. But for goaltenders, and look, there are some goaltenders that are shorter than 6'4", certainly. But if you are big and you can move from side to side, and I thought Stezga did that, like we saw in that save he made on Jake Gensel in the first period, which was one of the first period didn't have a lot of scoring chances for either team, but that was one of them.
Sure.
And he got over in time, and he's so big that he just took away a lot of the net there. Chief was impressed with his performance. I did think he looked a little nervous and was fighting the puck, but the Lightning didn't have a lot of attempts. I mean, what did they finish with? They finished with 50. Yeah. That feels a little on the high side, honestly.
How many of those were in the third period?
Yeah, and I mean, how many of those they finished with what, 23 shots on net? So, I mean, more than half of their attempts didn't reach Stezga. They missed the net or they were blocked. But I felt that there may have been an opportunity there to shoot. And often he was making the first save, but like, where is it? Like you could see he was kind of like, where is this? Do I have it? Like, is it underneath me? And the Lightning probably didn't do enough of that. Part of it was, to your point, they were passing when maybe they could have shot, but part of it too was they didn't have the puck as much as maybe they would have liked, especially in the second period. The second period was the most lopsided period for possession pro Seattle, even though that was the period in which the Lightning broke the tie and got the lead.
Yeah, and I am inclined to agree more with you, just the eye test with the goaltending, for Seattle. I did think there were some opportunities there for them to really make him even more uncomfortable because it did look like he was. But to your point, Seattle's not going to complain. They don't have to apologize for the Lightning passing up shots. And the reality is the Lightning, didn't test him as much. But it brings me back to my bigger point, and then we can get into anything specific, partner, that you want to discuss, whether it was individual performances, the Luke Glendening record continues.
Yes.
What a tremendous record that is, and I know his response would be, look, it just means that I haven't scored a ton, but I think it is an interesting stat, and I think
13-0 when he scores a goal.
And I think it speaks to, when you can sometimes get goals from your bottom six, and in this specific instance, your fourth line, how much of a lift that can give a team. But I will say this, and you've heard me say this a number of times over the course of our time together doing these shows, is that there's nobody who would disagree with the assertion or the observation that Seattle had a good majority of the play through the first 40 minutes. The chances and the lack of chances, or at least opportunities, from the Lightning. But oftentimes I will say it's impressive that you're able to generate that type of offense, especially through 40 minutes, and really make it one-sided as much as they did. That's unusual, I think, in an NHL game today. But what's the second part of the equation that I always bring up is what do you do with it?
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? Seattle didn't do anything with it. I mean, Dave, to come out of the second period and to have the Lightning leading 1-0 heading into the third with, I want to say how poorly they played, but if you want to say was subpar, sure.
They didn't play poorly. I don't think that they played poorly. And,
they were
and you
off.
know, like a lot of the commentary we heard after the game was about not cheating for offense. And that's fair. Like they didn't put themselves in horrible positions and basically feed Seattle's attack by getting greedy for offense. That much is absolutely true. They just weren't executing probably at the level that they needed to, and Seattle was. So it's kind of like that disparity is going to give the team that's executing more possession. And while you said they didn't do anything with it, part of that is in the first period especially, they didn't really generate much, and maybe that was them just not executing at the very end of a play to set up a teammate with a chance to score. But in the second period, they definitely had chances.
Yep.
I mean, they had 18 shots on net, and I was looking at the play-by-play. They had one sequence where they had 4 shots all around the net in a 3-second span. Tanev had 3 of them. It was like boom, 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 boom. And then after Hagel scored shorthanded, they had a sequence around the net later on that same power play. One of these wasn't even credited as a shot. It was McCann at the goal line extended, threw it on net. I guess they said it wouldn't have gone in, which is why It wasn't a shot. It didn't even appear on the play-by-play. But to me, that's a good play because he throws it on net. It hits Vasilevsky and pinballs right in front. And Bjorkstrand gets a grade A. And then Kakko had a second chance. So, I mean, to me, those were 3 shots. They counted as 2. I mean, those are tough saves. And they had guys, Seattle had guys get open in the middle of the ice for shot attempts that Vasilevsky had to stop. You know who's got a bomb? Dunn.
Yeah.
Dunn can rip it. I mean, I guess I hadn't seen him enough to see him wind up. He had one shot in the second period. Hard to tell if it was going wide or not, but Vasi had to react at the last second to snare it with his glove. So they definitely had chances. When you say they did nothing with it, especially in the second period, one reason, and you talked about this at the top of the show, a big reason why they did nothing with that momentum or their ability to carry play was number 88. I mean, 100%. Vasilevsky stopped the shots that they had that against another goalie may have gone in.
That was
another goalie on another night may have gone in.
That was the Lightning played much better. To me, that was a goaltender win last night for the reasons we just gave. I thought Seattle probably deserved a better fate. Maybe had they been going against a different goaltender, maybe had they been going against the equivalent of their goaltender, where things were a little shaky.
Right.
Maybe that changes. Seattle didn't play a bad game. I mean, if you were to ask Seattle, and I didn't read any of their commentary afterwards, mainly because I don't care they lost. But if I'm pretending here, if I'm talking to Seattle and the players and their coaches after the game, my sense is there's going to be some sort of narrative that we did some things that we wanted to do. Mm-hmm. We weren't completely unhappy with our performance. I don't know if they give credit. You ever notice before a game, the opposing team praises the other team, but then when they lose, it's, well, we got to, that was on us. We didn't do what we needed to do. My sense is if you were to ask those guys in a very private moment, maybe publicly, I don't know, that was one where they got vassied. That's kind of how I would look at it.
And really, when you look at the first 2 goals the Lightning scored, which were, I mean, they were the 2 biggest goals. The Glendening goal was an important insurance goal, but Seattle really didn't do anything wrong other than the goalie.
Right.
Seattle didn't do anything wrong on either of those goals. Hagel makes a really nice finish there, but Bjorkstrand is in position. It's not like it's a breakaway.
You got to make a save. You got to make a save on that.
That's what I'm saying. So they didn't get a save on the first one.
Yep.
And the second one is this play off the face-off, which I actually wouldn't mind getting into that because that's a very intriguing play.
Go there if you want.
I mentioned this after Kucherov scored the goal. He has scored from that position before, right off the face-off. And I mentioned on the air, because this guy had a hat trick yesterday, so now he's 13 goals away from setting the all-time record.
Another Russian.
Yeah. Especially when Backstrom was his center.
Yeah.
Backstrom is a lefty. Ovechkin is a righty. So this only works when you have a centerman who holds the stick in one direction and the shooter holds the stick in the other direction. Okay?
Yep.
So for Washington, it was on the other side of the ice when we saw this. So the lefty, in this case, Backstrom for Washington, is taking the face-off at the right circle to the left of the goalie. He's on his weak side. We've had this discussion, Greg, about strong side, weak side. When you're on your weak side, it means that the shaft of your stick is on the official side. It is harder to win a face-off on your weak side because if you're going to try and pull it back, the official is in the way of where the shaft of your stick is trying to go. So it's harder to get as much leverage. A player on his weak side taking a face-off against a player on his strong side, the player on his strong side will have an advantage. It doesn't mean that that player is automatically going to win the face-off, and we've talked about a guy like Crosby can win it on his forehand, so the shaft is not getting interfered with by the official, and he's very good at winning face-offs, Crosby, and he's not the only one who does it, but most players will try and win a face-off conventionally on their weak side, on their backhand. So it is harder to win that sort of face-off. But in the offensive zone, if you can win it, think about where the stick blade is. It is in the middle of it's pointed toward the middle of the ice. So if you can win it on your backhand and you position it in such a way, it's going to go backwards toward the middle of the ice. If you have a shooter waiting outside the circle, in the Washington case, Ovechkin as a righty is going to come to him where he can shoot a one-timer. Ovechkin, I don't know how many of his 800 and whatever, 82 goals at this point have been scored this way, but he has scored more than one or two. Directly off a face-off, Backstrom wins it right to him, and he can drill it. We know that. He's going to be the all-time goal-scoring leader for a reason. He can shoot. He can score from anywhere. Puts him in a position and is right off the draw. So, I mean, the goalie, it's a tough save for the goalie. I mean, he's got to be ready for it, but where's the puck going? Right. Like, it's off his stick in an instant.
Right.
So this is on the other side of the ice. Instead of a lefty faceoff guy, it's a righty faceoff guy, Point. Instead of a righty shooter, Ovechkin, it's a lefty shooter, Kucherov. Same idea, though. Point has to win the faceoff on his backhand, on his weak side, which he does, and it comes right to Kucherov. We've seen Point win faceoffs to Kucherov in that spot, and Kucherov has scored from there, not as often as Ovechkin did back in the day with Backstrom winning faceoffs to him. And it might even be, I think Strome might be his centerman now. Maybe Strome does it too.
Correct. Yeah.
But Kucherov has sometimes shot the puck and it's not gone in. Like the goalie makes a save or it misses the net. I mean, he's zipping it. He's shooting as quickly as he can to get it off as quickly as he can. Last night, he beat the goalie short side. So is that on the goalie? It's a tough save. But, I mean, Seattle didn't really do anything wrong except lose the faceoff. And the issue, if you want to call it that, for Seattle was their faceoff guy was also on his weak side. It was Beniers. So you had Point on his weak side and Beniers on his weak side, which kind of, it's more of an even playing field there. And Point's able to win the faceoff. So Phil once told me that Stan Fischler, who's the longtime, writer in the New York area, he's covered all the New York teams. He's been on TV, very, very well known in the hockey circles. And Phil, of course, played in New York and was a manager there, and broadcaster. And before he came to Florida, he's like, Stan Fischler once said to me, face-offs aren't important. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. You can just picture, Phil saying this.
Right.
He's like, face-offs are very important.
Yeah,
with Phil. Face-offs
who isn't?
Very, very important.
Yes.
I mean, some face-offs are more important than others. Like a neutral zone face-off, the team that wins it gets possession, but you're not necessarily in a position to score right away. The face-offs in the offensive or / defensive zones, depending on which team you're on, are very, very important. Because a face-off lost in your own zone could lead to a scoring chance against. A face-off won in your own zone could allow you to alleviate pressure and not have something bad happen. Well, that was one right off a draw. It led to a goal. It was a huge goal. Gave the Lightning an insurance tally, one they would need, and it turned out to be the game winner. But if you look at Seattle's body of work, like other than the goalie being unable to give them saves on the Hagel shorthanded goal and that one off the face-off, which there are a lot of goalies that are going to have trouble with a shot like that.
Yeah.
I mean, did Seattle do anything wrong in either one of those goals? Honestly,
would you say it's a team making a play?
It's a team making a play.
You know, I
Right.
mean, I don't.
There
wanna,
wasn't a flagrant mistake there.
No.
Is what I'm saying.
No.
It just happens. Like, that's hockey, and you can live with a play like that. Let's say one of the plays. like
Yeah, I was
that,
going to say, I
if
think
you were able to score yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So if Seattle had popped in a couple of goals when they were carrying play, let's say one of those two goes in, you're still up in the game, right? You can still live with that. But when you're looking at a goose egg and the other team gets a couple of looks at the net and it goes in, it's very frustrating, right? And
Yeah,
it wasn't
and
even like they made a huge mistake on either one of those plays.
No, I think the Kucherov goal, I understand that one. Like, that's a great play. I mean, it is. I think the one on Hagel, you need to make the save. You mentioned they were in a position.
For the goalie. Yeah.
They're in a position. You're right. And, you got a guy on his backhand. And I listen, defer to Chief and a lot of former players, current players. They'll tell you that the backhand is one of the more difficult shots to stop.
Chief said he should have stopped it, though, too.
But so I was willing to give him benefit of the doubt. But I feel like in that type of game, it's when you make those saves too. That's a momentum shift right there. And so I agree with you. In theory, if you're Seattle, you're probably looking at that and saying, positionally, I mean, we kind of were in the right areas, but the Lightning made a couple of plays. I'm a little surprised. Look, I confess I don't watch Seattle that much during the regular season, but to your point about their roster, it's not a bad roster. But I actually think they should be a little bit better based off of what you mentioned with the depth scoring. I understand they don't maybe have a quote-unquote star.
It's a
Fine.
solid roster.
But maybe it's a solid roster that's just not elite.
Yeah, and they haven't had a good defensive year. I mean, offensively, they're middle of the pack.
Yeah.
They've not had a good defensive year to the point that Grubauer, who is not the main guy anymore. I mean, Joey Decourt is, but Grubauer's in the minors. That tells you a lot about how their season has gone.
Yeah.
So I think that they are hoping, because look at the top picks they have. Beniers was a number 2 overall pick. They acquired Kakko, who was a number 2 overall pick. Shane Wright, I think, was a number 4 overall pick. I mean, he's certainly top 5, and he scored last night. He has not jumped straight to the NHL like Beniers did.
Sure.
But, I mean, they have guys that where they were drafted, when they were drafted, Seattle was thinking, these are going to be our game breakers. And then they acquired Kakko, who has the pedigree of the draft position, if not kind of the resume to this point. But Chief actually made him a second star. He was impressed.
He did.
And he's going to get more. I mean, honestly, I'm not quite sure where he's been in the Rangers kind of mix since we saw them in the 2022 playoffs when they were the kid line with Kakko, Hedl, and Lafreniere. And only one of those guys is still with the Rangers at this point. Lafreniere has blossomed, though, into a high-end player. The other two didn't. Hedl's had a lot of injury issues, concussion problems. And Kakko, I just don't know if Kakko was given the same opportunity to show what he can do in New York that he's getting and going to continue to get in Seattle. And I agree with Chief. Like, he was on the puck last night. He's a big guy. He's got clearly good offensive instincts. Vasi took away a couple of chances that he had. So, I think that's what Seattle is hoping for, that at some point they get some game breakers. And Decourt is a good goalie. Like, his numbers are impressive. So maybe they look to build around that. But if you're going to fall off the race in the West this year, it's tough to get back in, because there are so many teams that have done well that are grabbing some of those spots. I mean, look in the Central. Pretty much from the first month and a half of the season, it's been Winnipeg, Minnesota, and Dallas.
Yep.
And then Colorado is kind of in the mix, right? So, like, where's your path? I mean, Seattle's in the other division, but even there, like, Vegas is in good shape. Edmonton's lost 3 in a row. We can get into them more tomorrow, but, they've solidified a good spot. So, there are just too many teams for them to jump over this year.
Yeah, they've got a lot of good players. Jared McCann is a guy that hit 40 goals before. I'm not sure he's close to that pace this year.
He's kind of been their guy of the guys they have. that they rely on for offense, he is one of the main guys. And he did hit the crossbar right before.
He's got a great shot.
Nick Paul scored the empty netter, which was another weird twist in the game where the
Yeah.
Lightning had the empty net goal disallowed, and then Seattle put on. Seattle didn't have much pressure in the third period throughout, but they got kind of a partial breakaway from Jaden Schwartz early-ish in the third period. Vasilevsky made the save. That was in the third period. And then following that, Seattle had one of those long offensive zone shifts.
Correct.
5-on-5. But that was really the only one they had in the third period until they pulled the goalie. Kucherov had the empty net goal wiped away, and then Seattle had about just under 2 minutes of consistent pressure. Yeah. And they had 4 shot attempts, and McCann hit the crossbar. Could have been 3-2. It wasn't. And then Paul scores the empty netter, and it was see you later. Like it was game over. But other than that one shift after the Schwartz chance and then the 6-on-5, Seattle didn't have much pressure that they were able to generate. But to your point, McCann can shoot. And we saw that when he hit the crossbar. The one win that Seattle has had over the Lightning since Seattle came into the league was last year at Amalie, an overtime win, and McCann scored that goal in a 4-on-3 power play with a bomb. I mean, he ripped it. So he has that in his arsenal. But, I mean, it's not like he's scoring 40 goals with Seattle or 50 goals, right? I mean, he hasn't really evolved into their game breaker. I mean, he was playing on their third line last night.
Yeah.
So.
Good player, but I feel like you could probably say a lot of that up and down the lineup. Good player. Jaden Schwartz, good player, but not, I don't know, a difference maker at this point. And, that's something that, I'm sure, they're working towards. J.J. Moser returned to the lineup last night, which was nice to see. And did we get a glimpse of what that back end's going to look like, when everybody is healthy?
So they were rotating. So it started Moser and Hedman, and it didn't go away from Moser and Hedman. Like, Moser played with Hedman periodically through the night, but we also saw Radish with Hedman, and we saw a little bit of Moser with Lilleberg. So Rob Zettler was rotating them. If I'm being perfectly honest, and we try and be honest on the show, Moser looked like a guy who would miss 28 games. I mean, he was healthy, but it's unreasonable to expect that he's just going to, like what Brian Engblom says about like jumping in the washing machine on spin, right? I mean, we're gearing up here for the stretch run, and that's not an easy lift when you've been out since mid-December. So I expect he's going to get back to where we saw him before he got hurt. And he wasn't subpar yesterday. I just think that little details of his game weren't quite as buttoned up as we've seen. Like, puck got past him as he tried to hold it in at the blue line, and he had a couple of miscues coming out of the defensive zone. He wasn't the only one, but I thought it was a good game for him to get his feet wet, and hopefully it's just onward and upward from here for him. And I don't know if they're going to keep him with Hedman, like consistently. And we've bandied this about. I mean, Nick Perbix was a healthy scratch last night. Nick Perbix has played good hockey for the Lightning. We may see an 11-7 lineup configuration here.
I don't know if Coop's got to commit to that 100%, whether it's in the regular season partner or whether it's in the postseason. Sometimes you stick with what's working. So if you do 12-6 and you're flowing pretty good, maybe you keep that extra defenseman sideline. But if you know how things go, especially in the playoffs, if you go down 1-0, 2-0, sometimes you make some lineup changes. And that could come in the form of 11-7. It could just mean maybe Perbix comes in for somebody and you stay 12-6. That's why I think that really is, to me, and this is a bigger conversation that we don't have to have today, although we've had it before on the show, where I do think Julian has a few chips to work with if he wanted to at the deadline to make his team even more impressive. Because, folks, I got news for you. We're how many games into the season? The Lightning, statistically, and where they are, they're one of the best teams in the league. And I know that maybe is stating the obvious, but I feel like, and maybe we're just so into the weeds with the fans and where things are this year that we don't say that enough, but they are rolling right now. Statistically speaking, where they are in the standings, they've got some games in hand, partner, where they could legitimately catch the Florida Panthers. And sometimes I think the comments that you read from Lightning fans is that this is a team that has major deficiencies and might not even make the playoffs. I'm exaggerating a bit, but I think let's give credit where credit's due. They are, 58 games into the season, and I'd say they're one of the better teams in the league.
56.
Yeah, 56. So I mean,
Yeah.
like, let's at least give credit where credit's due. And if Julian wants to do something bigger, sometimes you take from a position of strength to address a weakness. And while I think the weakness in terms of the depth scoring is getting better, you do have a lot of depth on the back end. And I think we saw that last night, how potentially that could play out. And so I'm just saying, I think Julian is looking at this and saying, how can we improve our team? And some other teams may be looking at our back end and saying, yeah, that's a pretty good back end. And if you want to dance at the trade deadline, you got to give up something to get something. But I think the Lightning may have that something. And it makes for an intriguing moment.
The Lightning have 7 NHL defensemen.
Yes.
And I believe, as I've said already on the show this year, they are 9 deep on D, including Crozier and Carlisle. I don't know that like a Declan Carlisle who's had, 2-3 games of NHL experience is going to be a guy that another team is going to say, yeah, we want that player and we're going to trade you this NHL caliber forward. Right. And the Lightning, as we've said, have enough cap space to add a forward, just adding the salary, and not giving up a player on their NHL roster or even a prospect who is playing in Syracuse, and they could just use a draft pick, let's say. Depends who you're getting, right? Like that's what I'm trying to say. You have been pretty consistent about saying this, and I've been pretty consistent in heading in the other direction. I like the decor that they have, and I would prefer to see them not move anyone off the NHL roster on defense. And the reason I say that is, first of all, they're all good players. But if you were looking at this playoff run as what you hope is going to be a deep playoff run, the likelihood of you needing players beyond, let's say they move one of the 7. I'm not suggesting they're moving Victor Hedman or Ryan McDonough or anybody like that. But, one of the guys who are, kind of near the bottom of this group of 7 in terms of how you're going to rank them, what is the likelihood that you may actually need a player like that if you were going to go on a deep playoff run? And look, if you move, let's just use Perbix as an example because he was scratched last night. Mm-hmm. Maybe you, to your line of thinking, you're like, well, we can get a higher end forward if we trade Nick Perbix to get that forward than if we just acquired a forward without giving up an NHL player in return. Okay, fair enough. But what are the odds that you may need Nick Perbix in a deep playoff run because you have an injury, right? And while I have been consistent in saying, like, I like Crozier and I like Carlisle, and Crozier got into the playoffs last year and played quite well, I still would like to have the depth. If you're thinking about a 2-month playoff run, which is how you want to think, right? Like, you want to think about that. But it may not work to get the player that you want without giving somebody up off your NHL roster. We'll see what the market yields. I'm not disagreeing with your point. I think the Lightning have players that other teams might be interested in on defense. I'm just saying selfishly, I would like to keep the stable full because we have seen in all of these deep playoff runs, you're going to have injuries. You are. And you're going to need to lean on some guys that maybe aren't starting game 1 of the playoffs in the lineup.
It's interesting. You mentioned Carlisle. I'm wondering if this is us spitballing to a degree, if more scouts or teams look at Crozier as an NHL-ready defenseman, they can.
San Jose took Jack Thompson last year in the Duclair deal.
Good point by you.
He had one game of NHL experience.
I know.
Crozier's farther along.
At Bolts Radio, if you want to get involved in the conversation, you certainly can do that. Is there anything else you wanted to jump into with that game? Tompkins backing up. I brought this up. I'm curious your thoughts on it because I think it becomes a problem when it is a problem. Mm-hmm. But Tompkins, the backup. Okay, Johansson, this injury is lingering.
You mean why Tompkins and not Halverson?
More so about Johansson. Is this something
he's battling an injury? I mean, he got hurt before the break, and clearly he's still injured.
But at some point, are we looking at this? Because you know how these injuries go. Teams are secretive. This could be something where it lingers on. Another week goes on. Another week goes on. And then Dave, we're at the trade deadline, and your backup is Tompkins or somebody else, and I'm asking simply the question: is that much to do about nothing? The backup goaltender? Is that another situation you got to look at and say, I'd kind of like to have a little bit more experience backing up Vasi if I know Johansson is struggling with an injury?
So not at this point, I don't think. And again, like if you're adding a backup goalie, you're adding salary.
You are.
You are, because Johansson's not going anywhere. Like, he's on the roster unless you throw him an LTIR, and I'm not quite sure how that would work after the deadline, because you're no longer worrying about accruing cap space. It's just managing the cap. Anyway, they know what the situation is with Johansson. We don't. So is this going to be another week? Is this going to be 2 weeks? I will just bring this up. 2 points. If you are going to spend some of your available cap space to get a backup goalie, that is left less space available to get another position player. 1. 2, Johansson got hurt at the end of the regular season last year. Now, this was after the trade deadline. But the Lightning didn't have any issue with riding out the end of the regular season with Matt Tompkins playing as the backup and getting into games. Tompkins played down the stretch for the Lightning in the regular season, including in that final game against Toronto, where Matthews was going for his 70th goal. So I think I'll use the word comfortable. The Lightning are comfortable, I think, based on what we saw last year, having Matt Tompkins as a backup to Vasilevsky.
I think that makes sense.
And they went into the playoffs with
sense.
Tompkins as the backup.
Yep.
I mean, that Vasi played in every game in that series against the Panthers, but Tompkins was the backup in all 5 of those games in the series. Johansson was still hurt.
I think that makes sense. At Bolts Radio, if you want to get involved in the conversation, you can. Just something to kind of keep an eye on, with the backup goaltender situation and how that's transpiring. Al says, I've seen them play a lot worse. They actually played better than expected considering the layoff. Yeah.
Well, they have played worse. Yeah. I think they got outplayed, though. And I think the reason they got outplayed in the first 2 periods was one team had shaken off the rust and one team hadn't.
Yeah. Basil says, wow, your impression of the game was different than mine. I didn't think Bolts played poorly to start the game. The defense checking was solid. While Seattle had more shots, I thought the Bolts moved the puck well and generated far more high-quality chances. I
disagree, Basil.
Yeah, I'll disagree with that on that one for sure.
I mean, they had their isolated chances,
Yeah.
and the Lightning are a team that can make plays. So Kucherov did get loose early in the game. That was the first shot that Stezga faced, and he made the save and was like, where is it? And Kucherov was trying to get to it, and Stezga covered it, and they had the Gensel chance. After Hagel scored, Point had that kind of dipsy-do move where he walked in front. That was a good save by Stezga. All of that is fair, Basil. The Lightning may have actually, not in the second period, but in the first period, they may have outchanced Seattle. They just didn't have the puck a lot. Why didn't they have the puck a lot? Because they struggled coming out of their own zone.
They did.
A, but B, and this was the bigger issue, was they couldn't close out plays in their own zone. Seattle had the puck and kept the puck. It was like passing it,
right.
Shooting it, retrieving it, keeping it, out of play, face-off. Lightning actually did well in face-offs through the first 2 periods, but they might win the face-off and not clear it, or it came out and Seattle was entering the zone really easily too. Chief was getting annoyed by that, actually, because I think he said it on the air and off the air. Like, they were just entering the zone with ease, and once they entered the zone, they held on to the puck. So if you were to actually track scoring chances, Basil, the Lightning did a lot with a little. Like, they actually generated some chances with very little possession until the third period. And Seattle had a harder time generating chances. But I think Seattle did generate chances in the second period. We just laid out some of them. And, the Lightning are going to have to be better against Edmonton. I mean, I'll repeat what I said at the start of the show. If the Edmonton Oilers get the amount of possession time that Seattle got in last night's game, and that happens tomorrow, look out, because they're going to need a Herculean effort from Vasilevsky in a game like that. Or the Lightning are going to they're going to give up some goals, because it's inevitable when you have McDavid and Draisaitl and the rest dancing around the offensive zone and feeling puffed out with their chest because they have the puck so much. Lightning got to offset that by kind of outscoring their possession disadvantage. Hopefully the Lightning are a lot more buttoned up coming out of the defensive zone, and this is the point I'm going to make again, closing off plays when the other team has it. Erase a guy, get the puck back, get it out. That did not happen last night for much of the first two periods.
I mean, Edmonton, the other component to this, and I think you were implying that, I mean, they're going to come into tomorrow night's game with an attitude.
Yeah, they've been horrible defensively.
They gave
in
up
the first
6
two
goals.
games.
They gave up 6 goals to Philadelphia and 7 to Washington. Now, look, Washington...
A couple of empty netters in there, but still.
For sure.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you give up 5+ goals in a game. I don't care when it occurs. You're not happy. And I think Edmonton, obviously, high expectations, maybe coming down from the Four Nations tournament a bit, and okay, let's get refocused. Washington's a really good team. I think we have to give credit where credit's due there. They are rolling, and they're a bear to handle. But I think one of the things I did notice from Hagel's comments yesterday, partner, I don't know if you picked up on this, should we have expected not only sloppy play coming out of this break, but almost initially games that had more crooked numbers on it? You know, he almost made the case like, you know, you looked around the league and you saw a bunch of 5-6 goal games, 7 goal games. Pittsburgh gave up 8. And maybe we should have looked at that a little bit more and said, okay, maybe not to that degree, but maybe we were going to see some scores that weren't indicative of what they were doing.
Teams were flat offensively. I mean, Seattle and Florida played a 2-1 game on Saturday, and I think that was just a low-chance game.
That's fair.
So the execution may have been off for both teams. I don't know. I mean, I didn't watch a lot of games on Saturday, any games on Saturday, to be completely honest. So I'm just kind of following the box scores. If fans watch some of the games, the out-of-town games, then they can let us know. So I think we've seen a mix.
Yeah.
I want to reemphasize the point, though. The Lightning, Al is right. The Lightning have played worse. I think what we saw last night, though, was one team was executing at a higher level than the other. And I think the team that was on the lower end of the execution quotient, the Lightning, had trouble because they had this break. The break is now gone. I like their third period. Hopefully they can carry that into Tuesday's game against Edmonton. And like we keep saying, Edmonton's going to be ticked off and Edmonton's giving up all these goals and they're going to, be fit to be tied. Like sometimes it can feed on itself too. We've seen that with the Lightning when they've struggled. Like all of a sudden Edmonton's like, what the heck is going on here? We come out of the break, we've given up all these goals. Like they may not be able to snap their fingers and correct it. So the wounded animal is a dangerous animal, right? I mean, they're not wounded in terms of the standings. They're in good shape, but they're wounded in terms of how they feel about their game right now. Sometimes the wounded animal is a dangerous animal. Sometimes the wounded animal is in fact wounded. And you can exploit that weakness, basically. We'll see how the Oilers look tomorrow. We'll probably always bring in Jack Michaels, so we'll get his assessment.
Pittsburgh
tomorrow is a TNT game, isn't it? I see it's a 7:30 start.
Al had a question about that. He said that I noticed the Tuesday's Lightning game is on ESPN Plus.
Oh, ESPN Plus, okay,
and not FanDuel. Is that correct?
Well, the fact that it's 7:30 means that it's not on FanDuel. It's got to be a national. I didn't know which network was carrying it. I don't pay attention to that, honestly, because we worry about our own broadcast.
Sure.
ESPN Plus is correct. Thank you, Steve.
So listen to us and watch the game. That's what we always advise you to do, when it comes to this. Al also says, I might be wrong, but I don't see Julien Brisebois bringing in a lot of players at the trade deadline. Maybe 1 or 2 forwards and a defenseman. Also, with JoJo's injury history and expiring contract, might Julien Brisebois look to replace him now? You need a proven, competent backup for the future. Thoughts? So let me answer the first question, partner.
Yeah, go for it.
If you tell me the Lightning are going to add 1 or 2 forwards and a defenseman, I think that's a lot.
Yeah.
Let me just be very clear. Let me be very clear. You're kind of revamping a roster to a degree. I maintain that I think 1 is very plausible, and if you did 2, I could see that happening, depending on. If you do deal from a position of strength, and let's say it's the back end, that maybe in a smaller deal, you end up trying to get more of a depth defenseman just to overcome some injury issues potentially down the road. Not at the same level as the guy you gave up, but sometimes you see that. I can remember, the Penguins several years, not to say Ron Hansey was a small piece. He ended up playing a big role for them, I think, in their second cup run. But they also had a couple of other defensemen who, just didn't play a lot that were added to the roster more for depth, even though you might have given up somebody else to acquire, a legitimate top forward. So I think you could see them doing that. I've been pretty consistent. I do think forward, but I could also see them a depth defenseman if they trade from a position of strength. The goaltender, we just kind of had that conversation. Look, if JoJo's healthy, he's your guy behind Bassey. I mean, that's just how it is. Even if he's not healthy, I'm not sure, unless you can make it work cap-wise, that you move on from him and find somebody else, because now you're kind of crowded, at the goaltender position.
And the other thing I'll add is I think there are going to be backup goalies available during the offseason. It's one of those things. Are you going to pay more of a premium at the deadline? You do. I mean, it doesn't always work out that way, but generally you're paying more of a premium at the deadline than you would during the offseason. And I think there'll be plenty of, maybe not plenty, but there will be backup goaltending options if they cannot get Johansson re-signed, assuming they want to re-sign Johansson, he wants to come back as Vasilevsky's backup. They may look to one of these minor league guys. They may say Tompkins and or Halverson, we really like them, and we're going to give them a shot to back up Vasilevsky. Or they look around the league for a goalie who is on an expiring contract this year and try and lure that player. And the fact that the cap is going up means that, if maybe you have to spend a little bit more to get the backup goalie that you want, you can do that. That would be my expectation, Al. And I'm with Greg. When you say add a couple of forwards and a defenseman, that to me is probably on par with what I think Julian would love to be able to do if all these moves work out. Not doing much might be adding like one player or none. That would be my definition of not doing much.
Do you think? Look, you and I.
Assuming that one player is not the marquee Alex Tuck type player. Yeah, that's the guy that we've heard the fans talk about.
I love it. Go after the Tuck. Get him.
Yeah.
Get him.
We want Mitch Marner to play in a line with the Eagle and Sorrel.
That was a good one.
In fairness, the fan was saying next year, but
that was a good one for sure. It is interesting when you watch Nick Paul play on a second line. But then you and I have talked about, I think in a perfect world, he could drive kind of a third line and do a lot of things. And
Gergensons has looked good, though. I think he's looked good as the third line center. And one thing we didn't mention when we talked about the chances, Gergensons hit 2 posts yesterday in the first and the second. So this is
right
kind of backing up what Basil was saying. Like, they had their looks. They just didn't have the puck a lot.
Let me ask you this.
In the first 2 periods.
This could be a fun question. Outside of the fighting, because I think the player I'm going to compare Gergensons to was a tremendous fighter, even though you maybe didn't look at him as a heavyweight. Is there much difference of having Gergensons on a third line than Barclay Goodrow? If the other 2 guys on that third line can drive play a little bit more offensively, not to take anything away from Gergensons, but Goodrow on that third line with Coleman and Cord, partner, you would agree, wasn't asked to score a ton of goals. Now, he could chip in.
Yeah.
Can they kind of fill the same role? Skill-wise, what would you say? Gergensons, I don't think is that far off skill-wise than Goodrow, and you may even say he might be a little more skilled.
I'm going to answer that question. And I'm not asking this question like rhetorically where I definitively know the answer. I'm asking it as an open-ended question.
Sure.
But can you see Zemgus Girgensons being on a shutdown line?
He's out there on the PK, correct?
He's out there in the PK, but would you put him out against Barkov or Matthews or Pasternak?
So I'll come back and ask you the question. Isn't that kind of his role? More defensive-minded?
It has been more defensive-minded, but they've not used him in that role, and Barclay Goodrow was used in that role.
Would you be hesitant?
So that to me is as we
so that's
speak
that's
today,
a telling sign.
That as we speak today, you say, what's the difference? The difference is that John Cooper gave an outsized amount of responsibility to that full line. But it was all three players. Coleman, Goodrow, and Gord were given that responsibility when they could get the matchup. That was the matchup John Cooper wanted.
Right.
I confess, I have not seen him choose to put a line out with Girgensons on there when they've had a chance to match against the other team's top line.
Is it fair to say
Doesn't mean that he can't do it.
Is it fair to
why
say
I didn't ask the question rhetorically?
It's a good question.
But what we have seen is John Cooper does not have the same faith, if that is the right word.
Does he not have the faith?
Use the player in that role, or at least he hasn't found a combination that
was my
makes
question.
him comfortable.
Is it not about the faith? It's about the personnel. And not a knock on Girgensons that he can't do it, but I'm saying you and I have been talking about the third line. What's the third line?
Yeah.
And I mean, a perfect
right
world,
now,
if Nick Paul was the third line center, I mean,
right
does
now
that
it's
change?
JP, Gonsalves, and Girgensons.
So in
That's your third line.
that cannot be your shutdown. I mean, that has holes everywhere, in my opinion, when it comes to defense. But I'm saying if a Nick Paul was your third line center and a Girgensons was on your wing, and you found somebody else who was defensively responsible, would you be okay with that? I don't know. But look, they obviously see something in Girgensons to move him up in the lineup.
Well, he's earned it because I think he's playing his best hockey right now.
So that's what I mean. Like, I'm wondering, are we, maybe they're just a third line that's not a shutdown line then. But I don't think you're going to make your fourth line.
But I think a lot of this is going to look different after the deadline. If we expect that Julian is going to add at least one forward, maybe two, and who those forwards are, I think the whole forward lineup configuration is going to look different, and we'll be able to make more of a definitive statement on this. Now, if he can't do anything or chooses not to do anything, okay, let's revisit this. I mean, right now your shutdown line has Cirelli and Hagel on it. And that's fine. Like in 2022, when they didn't have Coleman, Gord, or Goodrow anymore, it was Cirelli, Hagel, and Killorn. That was the shutdown line. But you drew the comparison or asked for the comparison, spitballed about the comparison between Goodrow and Girgensons, and that is how I answered the question. The role that Barclay Goodrow had with those Lightning teams in 2020 and 2021 is and was different than how they have used Girgensons this year. That is how I answer the question. Does it mean the Lightning need a Gord line? A Gord line is going to be very hard to find. It is. Stanley Cup championship teams often have a Gord-type line. We mentioned the HBK line in Pittsburgh.
Yep.
Sure. Those third lines, if you can get them, are extremely valuable. But they are hard to find. And the Lightning may have to ask some combination of Cirelli, Hagel, and somebody else to be the checking line. And they're going to get the Matthews assignment. They're going to get the Barkov assignment. They're going to get that assignment.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just an interesting situation. As we kind of look at Girgensons' elevated role, he is playing well. But
he is playing well.
But maybe the person they get at the trade deadline bumps him down to where we typically would see maybe on the fourth line. And so maybe that's
Let's see how the dust settles after the deadline.
Get Ryan O'Reilly, and then we'll kind of see where things are, and we'll play things out that way. Partner, good job on a Monday. Always love to get those juices flowing.
Before we break, I just want to send a shout out to the fans who stopped by my table on the plaza yesterday. Thank you to everyone who stopped by. And I mean, many bought a book from me. And I'm always appreciative for that. But many just stopped by and were like, hey, we love listening to the show. We love the highlights after the game. I'm like, well, I have nothing to do with that. But I do my thing, and then other people take care of the highlights, including Jared Johnston and Steve Erstnick and some of the enterprising fans out there who put the clips on.
Yep.
But we love the support for Lightning Radio. So thank you to everyone who came out. And I will probably have some more, not only on the plaza, but as I come up with more signings.
Kind of another one.
I'll let you know, you Greg and you Steve.
Please let me know.
Yes. Yeah. So one fan came up and said, "Yeah, we heard you talking about this on Power Lunch." I'm yes, to Greg and Steve's dismay, I've been talking about this way too much for their liking.
We got to market it, baby, and we got a platform, and we got to do it. And it's great to see people still interested in wanting to buy the read because it's a great read for sure.
And there was one woman who came up. She was with a friend. She came up. She's like, "I just want to let you know, I got the book." at a previous. I'm not actually sure if she got it from me or just bought it, but she's like, I love the book. So she came up and told me that, and that
Love that.
meant a lot.
It's a good book, man. It's a good book.
I'm never going to say no to people saying nice things about it, but I was very appreciative. I was like, oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
But that was unnecessary and nice.
Thank you very much. Would you like to buy two? No, that's usually how.
It's fine.
It's fun. All right. We'll be back at it again tomorrow, game night. So it'll be a lot of fun. Get your questions in at Bolts Radio. Partner, great job. As always, thanks to Steve Versnick, Jared Johnston. And for you listening, we always appreciate it. I'm Greg Linnelli. You've been listening to Power Lunch on Lightning Radio.